Also going to do some activity through a Padlet, and hopefully there'll be opportunities for you to pause and ask questions at the end as well. I will do my best to collate questions and do some chairing of a Q&A at the end. So without further ado, we have Dr. Ruth Squire from Leeds Trinity University talking to us about ethics and access and participation, and potentially beyond, and the ramifications for our work in this space, and how we think about this practically as well. So Ruth, thank you so much for volunteering to do this session for us this afternoon. Over to you.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming along. I think it is quite a juicy topic, so hopefully we'll have some really exciting conversations today. So to give you a bit of background on myself, I've been working in access and participation for about 20 years. About half of that I was a practitioner and manager, and then I went completely mad and did a PhD in it, and I've been working as an evaluator researcher ever since. And that is really how I came to this topic. So about 2 years ago, I started having a lot more conversations with people about ethics. And I think ethics is something we do as evaluators. It's something that is naturally part of our practice and something we think about, but we don't necessarily have those conversations about ethics. And the thing that really prompted these conversations was, as many things are, it was the regulatory environment.
Oh, you've muted, Ruth.
Unmuted. Yes. Okay, so about 2 years ago, I was in the process of developing our access and participation plan at Leeds Trinity University, and part of that team and thinking about evaluation for that. And we had been indicated by the Office for Students that publication was going to be part of what we needed to think about in terms of evaluation. We needed to think about sharing our work beyond the borders of our institutions. And obviously, if you talk about publication in higher education, you get into conversations about ethical approval. And so the guidance from the Office of Students did mention this idea of ethical approval, and the fact that ethical approval might be appropriate. But there was also this additional sentence, which was, regardless of whether ethical approval is sought, well-established ethical principles should be considered. And this it kind of scratched at me. It made me think, okay, what is that? What are these well-established ethical principles? Are we all using the same ones? And actually, what does it mean to consider them? Because certainly in my training as an evaluator in my practice, it's not necessarily part of what I was trained in, certainly not to discuss explicitly ethics. It was something that came up as a researcher, but not necessarily in terms of evaluation. But it's also not really baked into the practices and kind of processes and systems of my institution. So I had this question at the back of my mind, kept scratching at me, and so I applied for some funding to look at this. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, some research that I did with other evaluators about what is it, what are these well-established ethical principles, and what do we actually mean to consider them. But I would also say the reason why this was getting to me was because of a broader question. Why actually do we care about ethics and access and participation? And I think it's why a lot of us come to access and participation work in general, and also specifically to evaluation, is because we think it's a good thing. We generally believe it's going to be something that creates change, that it is a tool potentially for social justice, that it is going to make a difference in some way to the world. And the thing in which it's going to make a difference to is access and participation, which we believe in as a principle. We may not agree exactly on what that looks like, but we are bringing values to the table when we are thinking about evaluation in this space. And so we need to talk about ethics, and we need to be really explicit about ethics, because that good that we are trying to create may not be the same for each of us, and it may not be for the same people. Who are we trying to create good for? What good does evaluation do in the world, and who does it do good for? It isn't just us in access and participation who might think about this. Evaluation scholars more broadly say that actually we have this real deficit around thinking about ethics. Even master's level training in evaluation does not necessarily include discussion of ethics specifically. And it's because we make this assumption that evaluation is a good thing and that's enough. And I think we need to go beyond that. And that's really what I was looking to explore a little bit more. I actually found in my reading this kind of framework that I think is really helpful for thinking about this issue of, well, why do we care about this? And it's from Picciotto, and Picciotto is looking at how we bring values into evaluation generally. And essentially saying there are 3 ways in which we might do this. The first being about looking at merit, which is essentially, does the intervention we are looking at actually meet the standards? Does it meet the outcomes we are expecting? And therefore, is it efficacious? And I think access and participation currently in the structure, regulatory structure, does really push us towards this, because we've set what our outcomes are in advance and we're thinking about, does it comply with those things? Are we essentially meeting the standards of the things we expect? You can also look at worth as a value you can bring into kind of your ethics process and evaluation. And that's essentially going, how does your intervention design, so the plan you've got for your intervention, actually meet the preferences and concerns of your stakeholders? Is it going to bring worth to the people involved? And this is essentially how we use theory of change. So that's getting the people around the table and saying, what is the outcome you expect from this? What outcome would you value? How are we working towards that? But again, in access and participation, I think we have some restrictions. Who are the stakeholders we can get around the table? And is there a power relationship amongst those stakeholders? Certainly, I know in practice that getting everybody around the table and everybody I'd want around the table to consider what they value is challenging. And who do I actually consider as important people in that process? It might be restricted or it might be limited. Really, what we need to be working towards is this idea of value. And this is where we take a public interest lens and go, what good is this doing beyond just thinking about the stakeholders in this intervention? Who is it making a difference to more broadly? Is this a good thing, this intervention, a good thing for society, for our institutions? So I think it's a really interesting kind of way of thinking about ethics and how we can bring it, and also where ethics might be a challenge for us in our particular sphere. So knowing all of that, I got together some other evaluators. So 13 evaluators, I was one of those, so 12 other evaluators. And we were looking at actually what are our ethical dilemmas in this space and how do we actually resolve them? What's the practical side of all of this? And had people from a mix of different roles. So you've got data analysts, people who are brand new to evaluation, people who've been in evaluation for years, people overseeing evaluation in their institutions, researchers, had people from universities, but also had people from the third sector. So we had a whole kind of mix. It was within the structure of the regulatory kind of framework we've got in England, but it was thinking about that kind of essentially, are we all kind of on the same page, or are there different things going on in different types of organizations? And what we did, we got together for a couple of online workshops, and that was where we talked about actually what are our biggest issues and concerns, and actually what do we think is most interesting out of all of that? What do we really want to look at? What's kind of pressing for us? And I used that to create a topic guide, and we then went away and each did a self-interview, which essentially means sitting in a room with yourself for 15, 20 minutes and responding to questions. And I can tell you, it's a very bizarre process, but it is quite good at maybe digging out some of the things that if you were with another person, you might not come to think of. So looked at those. I looked at all of those across our group and I came up with some themes. I brought some things from research as well, go, does it fit with this framework, this framework? And then we all got back together for a day to discuss all of that. It was slightly a bit of therapy, some very deep conversations going on from there. And that was essentially the process of the things I'm going to talk about here. And broadly speaking, what I discovered, or we discovered, is that ethics is absolutely everywhere in what we're doing. It is not a process that we do at one stage in our evaluation. It is in absolutely everything we're doing and considering. And maybe not always kind of things that are recognized, maybe in ethics guidance. So to give you some example, here are where some of the dilemmas that we were talking about arose. And these were things that were shared across the group. So this came up from more than one person. Firstly, in evaluation design, so actually how we design our evaluations, do we feel like they are equitable and inclusive? Are they actually serving the right purposes and they are involving the right people with the right skills? Are we, as evaluators, actually getting to choose what those evaluations look like, or is it restricted by something else? We had a lot about protecting rights and really caring about protecting the rights of our participants, so making sure that their data was only used for the purpose that we understood it, but also recognising that we are bringing their data into an organisation which may not see data and student data maybe as working that way. Making sure that maybe people have a right to participate. It's something we don't necessarily have in research ethics, but when we're thinking about evaluation, if somebody has taken part in an intervention, do they have a right to give their feedback and participate in any processes that come out of that? It's an interesting one to think about. Also, our independence. So do we want to be close to the organisation or the individuals who are delivering the intervention because that provides some benefits, or do we want to have that distance? How much control, again, do we have over the decision-making processes? Consent was a big one, and obviously this comes up in ethics processes, but sometimes feeling like the ethics processes we were being expected to follow were not ideal for actually getting informed consent, because our audience didn't want a 2-page information sheet. They needed something else. But our ethics processes from our institutions were still demanding that be the way. Thinking about the impact of our evaluations, are they actually doing the good in the world that we want them to do? Are people even reading them? And then just thinking about what we evaluate. Are we only evaluating the things in our access and participation plans and that certain people in an institution think is of value? Why are we not evaluating other things? So all of that, loads of dilemmas. Everything we do essentially is ethics. And to give you some examples, here are some kind of conversations and things that we picked up on. So I'll leave these for you to read, but to pick up on the two on the bottom, these are thinking about experimental methods and evaluators thinking about the ethics that come into that. And, you know, on one side kind of going, actually, I feel like it's my responsibility. That's good evaluation. I want to deliver that kind of evaluation. But there are ethical implications to that. And am I on my own in making those decisions about how that affects individuals and my institution? But then also feeling like being pushed towards experimental methods when you haven't necessarily got background or training in that, and you've got to deliver it really fast. To what extent is that creating an ethical issue? And then the ones on the top are really all about the impact of evaluation. Where is it going and what is being done with it? So is it just a report that nobody reads? Are people actually taking on board the learning? Do they want to hear what is being told? Or do they maybe just want to hear the nice bits? So yeah, hopefully, certainly all of this, by the end of it, I couldn't tell what were my quotes and what were other people's, because it all felt so familiar to my practice, and I think other people as well. I found one framework really helpful for me in thinking about this, and this is something that came out of research, the idea of true and mixed dilemmas. So a true ethical dilemma being one where you have two ethical principles and you are weighing them up against each other. And we get this all the time in our planning. So thinking about the impact of the person taking part in the evaluation versus the benefit it's going to be, the sort of knowledge you might get out. That's something we're balancing. And we do that all the time. That is a true ethical dilemma. A mixed dilemma is very different. It's where we know the right thing to do, and there is a clear ethical principle and direction, but life gets in the way, and processes and principles and power get in the way of us actually delivering that. So the intended benefit, the kind of good ethical thing that we want to come out of our evaluation was to change practice. However, we find that in our institution, findings are being routinely ignored. Can we then say that we are conducting our next evaluation with that principle in mind if we think it's going to be ignored? Real challenge. And we found that basically most of what we're facing is a mixed dilemma, not a true dilemma. We understand true dilemmas pretty well. Mixed ones are a lot more complicated, and they are different in different scenarios. And there are many different influencing factors that affect what we get in terms of an ethical dilemma, so what we identify, and then also how we deal with those, the resources we have to do something about it. And this is an adapted kind of structure from other evaluation contexts to make it a little bit more specific to access and participation. But I boiled it down to kind of 4 areas that affect what shape whether we're going to get those mixed issues, and then what kind of mixed issues we get, and then also how we deal with it. So number 1 being our organisational culture and resources. So if evaluation is seen as a good thing within your institution, it is given status. People think it's a good thing to listen to and discuss in senior meetings, and people want to dig into it being good. you're much less likely to have ethical issues maybe about your evaluations being heard or listened to, or maybe having the resources to conduct the type of evaluations you think are appropriate. However, is evaluation is maybe very junior to research in your institution, is not seen as important, potentially you might get issues around whether you can go through, I mean, I take one from my own practice, going through ethical approval wasn't something that was easy to agree with my institution because that's something for research, not for evaluation. And it took some time to really get that on the table. So your organizational culture and resources shapes the problems you get. It can also really help because if you have that status or you have those relationships or you have maybe more funding in your department, more people, you can respond in different ways. A group of people maybe making a point can make a far kind of more impact than another. We also bring our professional and personal values to our evaluation. So if we think a way of evaluating is a good way of doing it, we are more likely to have some hard lines on certain ethical things than others. They're going to be different potentially for us, but we are likely to be informed by that, and that's going to affect where we maybe put our effort into. It becomes from particular evaluation cultures or backgrounds. Again, we may be more prepared or experienced in coming up with solutions to different ethical problems. External stakeholders, generally these are about funders and regulators. So what do they actually want of our process? That really does guide what we do and what we think the ethical principles might be. But also external systems and processes. So we talked a lot about marketization and reputation here. A good evaluation might raise reputation. A bad evaluation might damage reputation. How sensitive our institutions are to that is an issue and does affect the ethical issues that we might face. So at this point, I'm going to turn you towards the Padlet that I've put in the chat. And the reason for this is that there's one task there that I want you to look at, and there are 3 different headings in this. I'll bring it on the screen in a moment. So here we are. Hopefully you can all see that. There are 3 headings here. What evaluators think evaluations for, what organizations think evaluation for, and what regulators and funders think evaluations for. And the reason I'm pointing you towards this, and I'm going to ask you to add some comments to this, is that this is where a lot of our issues arose. It's in the difference between these different areas that we start to get ethical problems arising. So, for example, I've put 3 different understandings of evaluation within here. They're very kind of basic understandings that we recognize that organizations and people are more complex than this, but we boil it down to the basics. If as an evaluator, I think that my evaluation is about testing whether this intervention achieves its outcomes, I've got one track that I'm on. However, my institution thinks that it's about demonstrating to funders that we are doing good things. Fundamentally, they are going to behave differently. So my institution is going to be looking at the good things within that evaluation. I'm going to be looking at all of the outcomes. The kind of regulators and funders might then only be looking at to draw the things that they think are relevant as useful outcomes. So I'm going to ask everybody to spend 5 minutes adding your thoughts to this as well. I'm going to take it off the screen so that people feel maybe a little bit more comfortable in adding your own on there. But if you could please put in what you think evaluators think evaluation is for, yourselves, might be other evaluators, organizations, and then regulators and funders. Just to say, you can add these as comments or new posts, whatever you feel comfortable with. Okay. Please do carry on adding them in there. I think they're absolutely fascinating. I appreciate the sarcasm in some places. And there is a certain element of humor there. And I think, there are obviously some frustrations that we appear to experience in some of these gaps between areas. There's actually a lot of overlap. And I think certainly there's a lot of agreement. But before I did this research, I was very kind of comfortable in saying evaluation can do all of these things. And it probably can, but we're not always having conversations about the implication of trying to do all these things at once. And I think that sometimes is where our ethical issues are arising, is that we are trying to meet so many different masters that we are not necessarily then keeping to some kind of principles that we want to hold in our evaluations. And so I am much more, I think, after this, we actually need to talk about what those differences are and what each evaluation is actually trying to do together, so that we don't find at the end of the day that the report we've produced that achieves everything we want it to do isn't then used in a completely different way by somebody over here, because that is obviously a serious challenge for the good of evaluation. The next stage, however, is to think about this practically, and there are going to be some kind of points out to you to share your kind of practical experiences of this. I want to share a little bit about how evaluators in our group were looking at actually enacting ethics in their particular environment, given the case that we know we're having all these mixed dilemmas. So let's take one ethical principle. Let's take beneficence. So I've been talking about good all the time. It feels like a good one to actually focus in. So beneficence, if we look at the kind of TASO guidance, this is described as the principle of doing good where possible. So essentially, your proposed research should do at least some good, and it should balance that against the harms, with more benefits than harms. Something I think we're pretty used to thinking about in our kind of evaluation work. To actually make sure that happens and that you're enacting that ethical principle, people are doing lots of different behaviors. And these are 4 areas that I pulled out particularly that are very common. So number 1, and this came up so much, evaluation is about relationships. It has been for so many evaluators about actually building the relationships with maybe the people delivering an intervention, maybe people within the institution that need to listen to what comes out of that intervention, but really making sure they're spending the time to build relationships to enhance that learning. I think evaluation is sometimes seen as a relatively technical practice, but the relationship building has been absolutely core for many people in terms of actually being able to deliver on that ethical principle. Secondly, it was about developing governance structures to enhance accountability. I think 2 of the cores of evaluation are often described as learning and accountability. And I think those are the 2 things that people are trying to get to in terms of those goods. So developing governance structures around the evaluation to make sure that evaluation is discussed in places where decisions might be made, to make sure that the quality of that evaluation kind of meets people's needs, to make sure maybe we're thinking about equity even within that governance process. So developing all of those has been part of it. Third is about using collaborative and participatory methods. So actually in designing evaluation, making sure that learning and accountability is happening through the process, maybe through involving the people who are practitioners, having it be a developmental experience for students and student researchers, but actually designing things around kind of having some good coming out of just the process of evaluation. And then 4, influencing. I put this slightly different to relationship building, because this is more about kind of directive relationships. So wanting to engage senior leaders with understanding what evaluation is and what they can do with it. What decisions can you make off the back of this report? It's not just nice information, but what can you do with it? And influencing them to make that part of their practice rather than it sitting maybe on evaluators. So those are the 4 areas that I picked out from these kind of conversations that we had However, I am interested, and I have spoken to many colleagues, some of whom are in the audience, about actually how do we do this, and I would love to hear from people here about how you do this. So I'm actually going to throw this back to you. I would like people to stick their hands up if you can, and tell us a little bit about how any of these things work in your context.
Well, thanks, Ruth. So we're looking for volunteers. You can see the hands going up. I think we've got Anne first.
Hi, hello. Well, just to jump in, I think an awful lot of what you're saying there, Ruth, and it's a really interesting talk. It really resonates with me. And the whole thing about your positionality and how you manage this ongoing process. Yeah. I should introduce myself. My name is Anne. I do evaluation for UniConnect, but I also do evaluation with another hat on for the APP and the University of Hull. And that can create certain ethical conflicts sometimes, simply because I think, as you referred to, theory of change, as it were, the idea sometimes that ethics is a bit like a theory of change, a tick box, and you just get it done, and then it's done, it's out of the way. Management just wants to push on. Billy Wong wrote a very good paper about this recently. But I think ethics is the same, that people think it's almost just done and gone. And from my point of view, sometimes I do not have the authority or the power to kind of say, no, this is an ongoing process. We have to keep going back to this. I need to know that this is being done, and I need to trust people across the organization who at different levels of power on how they are actually going to do this, or this is going to create a moral problem for me, even if nobody else. But I can see an awful lot of other people want to have a word, so I'm going to keep quiet now. But thank you, Ruth. Great talk.
I would pick up on, I think, one of the things that we ended up having conversations about, the loneliness of this, even if you're in an evaluation team, but the loneliness of being the person who maybe fills out the ethics form and then being, right, now I'm responsible for ethical behavior across this institution. And that being a bit of a moment.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I was just thinking about that as well, Ruth, when you put the point up on the screen about the responsibility for decision making, particularly around experimental approaches. That's huge, isn't it? When you think about it, and of course that that really resonated. But I thought I'd never seen that written down in the way that you've just articulated it. That made me think, yeah, that is quite a burden. That is quite a burden. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Shall we go to Julian?
Yeah, Ruth, thanks loads. This is so thought-provoking. My head's full already. I had so many things to unpick, but just to go back to your original question and point 4, which is influencing your leaders and stakeholders to make use of evaluation. And, going back to what you're saying about evaluation being a relational activity, I'm wondering if we sometimes need to rethink our relationship with the evaluation stakeholders. So it becomes, if it was more of a kind of commissioning process, then we're shifting some of the responsibility onto the stakeholders who ask for evaluation to define what they expect to see. And then I guess implicitly they have some responsibility for reacting to the outcomes. So I think that kind of the commissioning process can be as simple as someone in a meeting saying, oh, we need to evaluate this. And then it sort of trickles down the organization and lands on someone's desk. But they've then an absence in responsibility for, okay, the things you've identified in terms of working with students to gather data and perhaps co-create, to make sure that their input is valued as well. So yeah, it's that kind of bigger framing, isn't it?
I actually found there's some resources, I think, on the Evaluation Society, which is essentially around that contracting process, that I used within my institution. Unfortunately, the first time I used it, it kind of resulted in them not wanting to do an evaluation because they realized how complicated it might be. So I can't say it's a success, but I did certainly find going through that process made me feel better. And I imagine it might be the same for other people, and there might be maybe receptive audiences than the particular one I was dealing with.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth, for that. Yeah, I also, it's interesting the idea of a commissioning and the responsibility once decisions are made, going back to my previous point. A couple of other hands up as well for you. So I think we'll go to Diana. Hi, Diana.
Hi, I'm Diana Pritchard, and I'm Head of Educational Development and Evaluation at the University of Bedfordshire. So thanks, Ruth, for this. I was one of the evaluators in the team, so enjoyed very much the process. Answering this question that you've thrown out to us about what practices it might look like in particular institutional contexts, but also answering or addressing the issue that several have raised about the issue of being lonely. One of the things that I did in setting up this the evaluation practice at the university was, if you like, to spread the blame, to bring more into the circle of the dilemma, the ethical dilemma that we found ourselves in. So I set up internally an advisory panel of academics at different career stages, so from head of school to early mid-career, as well as my evaluation team, with a view for us to be able to sort of bounce off initial plans that we have to actually also draw on their discipline and research method expertise by sharing with them our research evaluation proposals. So we also invited an external, which happened to be Ruth as well. So as another way of, if you like, sharing across the sector and developing an evaluation culture within the institution. So, likewise, bringing more people into the discussion about the institutional evaluation space rather than the educational research activities. Thanks.
I think, I mean, obviously I've been involved with it and we've spoken about it. I think it is it's been a really interesting model to be involved with, but those discussions have been, I think, really rich in terms of thinking about things from different angles that I don't have one of those at my institution. I can see a huge benefit to that. Loneliness of ethics is also a challenge in terms of the ethical things that we will think of in the short amount of space that we have, and that different input, I think, is incredibly powerful.
Lovely. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Diana. I like the idea of evaluation advisory groups. I think that's a good practical takeaway. I think we've got Rebecca next.
Hello, I'm Rebecca. I am the evaluation manager at the University of Law, and we're sort of a specialist provider, and most of my sort of academic colleagues come from the professions rather than research backgrounds, so we don't have that kind of research intensive culture. And I've done a lot of work on that relationship building side, because I think we faced a lot of challenges, as I think many people have, within that kind of, I guess, the more process-based stuff, so like ethical approval within your institution for APP work and how that kind of pans out. So we had a very small institutional ethics committee, but they were mostly sort of dealing with student dissertation projects, small scale stuff, and I'm not sure they'd ever had an ethics application from a business professional before. And I think we faced a lot of challenges working through that, so kind of building relationships with our sort of academic enhancement team and other colleagues within that ethics space to really understand. And I'd seen something in the comment in the chat earlier about how evaluation is different to research, and also where there is definite overlap. And I think obviously a lot of our evaluation is underpinned by theory, but getting people to understand we weren't applying for ethical approval to run an intervention. It was around the evaluation as an activity was a big challenge, but we've come quite a long way with that. I know as a result of working on this, I joined the ethics committee, but I actually think that's really helpful because it's that team of people who've been involved in reviewing our processes, documentation, everything. So I've been able to kind of really bring forward that evaluation perspective into the institutional processes, and also sort of create a voice as our institution grows as a sort of more research focused, and particularly in various academic areas. We've managed to kind of maintain those relationships and have a voice, and not kind of just be seen as some sort of like administrative element that's sort of not related to the rest of the kind of academic work of the university. So yeah, it's been a process and it's still ongoing, but I do think reaching out and kind of helping colleagues understand what you're doing and why has been really important.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's so relatable, and especially the approval for activities. The number of comments that we get back that are kind of, "Oh, should you be running this activity?" I was like, not what I'm asking. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. And I totally agree with Rebecca about finding an ally within the ethics approval process. So if that's the chair of your ethics committee, if that's a member of the board, getting onto the board yourself, I've done the same, and trying to build those relationships, but also to address some of the kind of definition differences and silos sometimes that these worlds operate in. Yeah, massively agree with that. And then we'll come to Peter.
Hello, I'm Pete. I'm at Nottingham-Trent University, Research and Evaluation Coordinator here. I think, firstly, thank you, Ruth, for what you've discussed so far. As you were talking, it made me sort of think about all the stuff that I do that I don't usually think about as an ethics thing, but it's kind of things we talk about and think about as we do our work. So maybe I need to think a bit more about this and take a bit more time to sort of reflect on all this kind of stuff as I'm going. In terms of your list here, one of the things that stood out to me was the point 3 about using participatory methods. That's something that I'm more and more interested in trying to do. And I think the funny thing that's I'm thinking about with this is that it's almost throwing up its own ethical questions as well around like burden. Are we putting a burden on the people to sort of be involved in evaluation, and what does that look like? Is that an ethical or moral quandary in itself? So I guess I just wondered if anyone else had any thoughts on that one, or if that's just me overthinking.
I don't think it's overthinking at all. It's something I worry about. I think we have a huge amount of it tends to be a favored thing. We are an educational school. People love to do projects with students, but don't necessarily think about how much time our students have, and our students are very time poor. And whilst it might be a really rich activity, it has two effects. It restricts the people who are involved in the evaluation, which does mean we tend to get the same voices over and over. But also I think it does put up sometimes a burden. And yeah, absolutely, it's something that I'm not asked about in my ethics approval processes, but I think about all the time.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. Have we got time for more questions, Ruth, or did you want to move on? We've got a couple more questions if you've got time.
Do have time. What I am going to point everybody to, however, is back in the Padlet, there are a number of points about what we could be doing about this. And I would love for people, if you have thoughts that you haven't been able to share here or want to add further comments to that, please do keep doing that.
Okay, so we'll keep, thank you, Ruth, for highlighting back into the Padlet as well. The practical is really useful. Carla, Femi, did you want to ask questions of Ruth? I think we have a little bit of time if you do.
It was just in response to what the previous one was said. That's one thing I've been dealing with for years, but I've got a background not just as an evaluator, but as a kind of community worker as well. And part of it is working out an incentive structure that gets people involved to the extent to which they feel possible. But my gold standard within every project is I always call it the menu. You know, you should have a participatory structure that gives people the opportunity to get involved to the extent to which they feel comfortable, but also you try to make it like it has its own coherence. So if and when someone does drop out, you don't have to throw everything away, but it's sensitive enough to understand apathy, disinterest, or increasing engagement. And, you know, that's the challenge in every project, which I've tried to kind of put into place. But that's, again, this is a pretty words. Putting it into practice is a bloody headache. So what do you call it? If you can do that, then yeah, I think you've got the basis of a good collaborative or participatory project.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. That's really an insightful reflection. I like that idea of a menu. Is that something you've come across before, Ruth, in relation to number 3?
No, but that word, like it's sitting with me and it's sparking a lot of ideas. I think it speaks to what we've been trying to do, but that, yeah, sums it up beautifully. Thank you so much, Femi.
Yeah, and what these kind of things are pointing to is that we need to have, and some people have talked about the kind of culture around evaluation, and we need some kind of institutional strategies for which our evaluation sits, because then we can have a coherent and consistent, but also adaptable and flexible approach to each evaluation request. We might have an advisory board that's framed within that strategy, but we have almost an infrastructure to support the decisions that we're making, that we can embed our commitment to participation. We can have an incentive structure within that, and that again also speaks to that notion of being lonely, isn't it? So what do we pin ourselves on when we're trying to make those decisions, or we're trying to get traction with the work that we're doing? I think that's really fascinating reflections. Did you want to come back in, Femi, or is that a hand from before?
No, just the other point as well. I've been, one of the things which I've also been looking for is something that to evaluate the kind of efficacy of participation and collaboration in and of itself. I've only seen one decent resource on the basis of it that's come out this year, but if anything, anybody does hear of anything, I would love to see how, because I think that would make the overall kind of structure of relationship building and enhancing learning and accountability all the more robust. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And there's some interesting comments in the chat about that as well. I'm hoping that we might be able to get to some of those too. Ruth, over to you. We've got a little bit of time left for you to carry on and point us to other insightful reflections.
There's pressure. Okay, so talking about what we're already doing. Actually, I just wanted to point people in the direction of some of these, because this is some of the reading that I did that I found those kind of interesting and kind of useful frameworks for thinking about evaluation. I think one of the things to note is that we are not alone in the field of evaluation in dealing with this, but we are also not alone. We are all in this room talking about issues that we are facing on a regular basis, and maybe we've never called them ethics before, but I think there is a power and value in naming them as ethical issues, because I think they speak to some of the tiredness we sometimes feel in these roles of being, I am trying to achieve this good, why is everything working against me? And certainly I think, when we started this research, I said to everybody who took part in it, I am not promising that this is going to make this feel any better. And certainly after having spent 6 months talking about ethical challenges and how many of them there actually are in our work, and how many of them may be caused by the systems and environments that we are in, didn't necessarily feel any better about it. But I did feel really positive that I was in a room full of people who understood that, who were creating solutions all the time out of what they had just in front of them. And I think the more that we can get together and share that, more positive. But I think there is also a message about the fact this isn't just the job of evaluators. I think most ethical guidelines tend to say, you as the lead person are responsible for this. However, there are many aspects of doing our evaluation that we are not necessarily in charge of, even though we might feel responsible. And there are examples of ethical guidelines in other parts of the world. The one I really liked was the evaluation, it's the Australasian Evaluation Society. They have ethical guidelines that is about all of the different stakeholders involved in these kind of processes, and what it might mean to be a commissioner, what it might mean to be a participant, what it might mean to be somewhere that employs evaluators. And I think that was a really useful framework for me for thinking about the fact that this is a shared commitment and a shared responsibility. And I think the more we can maybe push some of that and framing it ethically, not just as this is a practical problem that I have, I hope that that might create some change and some difference.
Excellent. Thank you, Ruth. Yeah, and I'm hoping that this is also, and I've seen lots of people connecting in the chat about this is also the space where we can bring some of those reflections, practical suggestions and solutions, but also sometimes just share the dilemmas. You know, we talk a lot in the Evaluation Collective about talking about the things that are pertinent to us and the evaluation community. And I'm seeing people in the chat sharing resources, and that's what we need to do. We need to make sure that we help ourselves, and quite often, as people have been introducing themselves as well, it might be that we're small teams, we're single teams sometimes within universities, so being able to reach out into communities like this I think is really important. I'm just going to go back to one of the questions that was in the chat right at the beginning, Ruth, if that's okay, and pose this to you. Shaylee asked this question, and it's about definitions. So I think in some of the reflections that you've presented, there's an assumed definition of evaluation, I think, and how that may or may not differ to research, and almost an assumed definition of ethics in evaluation as well. And I think Shirley was asking about the decisions that you've made around the definitions that you've made, and how perhaps you shared these with participants and that guided the conversations that you had with participants. So it was a question about definitions. So I'll start with that one before let's move on to some practical stuff.
So there could have come with a lot of different definitions. And to be honest, one of the things I did at the start was saying, okay, when I'm talking about ethics, we're going to get some overlap with values. We're going to get some overlap with just kind of practice generally. I'm going to be really broad about what I mean by ethics. I'm going to be really kind of open to what you think is an ethical issue. What is causing you some kind of discomfort that you would frame in terms of values, ethical principles? And so we were really deliberately broad. We didn't come down to a particular definition. I think partly because we haven't talked about ethics in this space. The times when we have talked about ethics tends to be with looking at research ethics guidance. And for me, that doesn't quite cover all of it in terms of evaluation. I think there are some specific differences about evaluation ethics that are slightly different to research ethics. I talked about right to participate. That's one we don't necessarily deal with in research ethics processes, but I think there are other things about acknowledging the political context and the fact. So, for example, an evaluation very quickly can affect the material circumstances of the people involved in it. People working on interventions, people maybe working with evaluators, it can affect the job of the evaluator. And so we have some kind of principles around care that maybe don't apply to all research kind of research ethics. And so I kind of didn't want to pin it on one type or one model. I wanted people to kind of come with their own, and also to see, because I mean, I'm from an educational research background. I use BEER as kind of guidelines around ethics when I'm thinking about designing projects. I don't think everybody does that. Other people will have different ones. So it's kind of coming with those different things. So yeah, really open. I did, however, pinpoint that my values in evaluation, I thought it's really important to come with this and say, I think evaluation is about process. For me, the good in evaluation is about the process of evaluation and the learning and accountability through that. I'm not a kind of, it's the end product person. I'm very much, it's about process. And so I did kind of put that out there as that being how I understood evaluation, because people will come to it in different ways and from different experiences. And all of those are totally valid. I would say we wouldn't have all made the same call on the same ethical principle. Some of us would have maybe weighted particular types of research as creating more good than others. And that's fine, as long as we've got those frameworks for talking about it and understanding it and weighing it up. It's when those decisions, I think, are made invisibly that we have challenges.
Excellent, thank you, Ruth. And then just a final question I think we've got time for, which is something which struck me from the Padlet, and I think somebody posed this in the chat. And it was the ethics of the unpublished or unactioned piece of evaluation, which I'm sure many of us have struggled with. So it's one thing to publish and then the recipient or the commissioner to have a view on what you've said, and how that goes forward. There's another position, which is that it doesn't even get to that point, or the point that you want it to reach. It's the kind of desk drawer syndrome that we've talked about. So in your research, did you talk about this notion of the ethics of unpublished or unappreciated? Because there is something in relation to our participants in relation to that, isn't it, as well, the time that we've taken, and then the responsibility which we have to air their reflections. I wonder if that came up.
We had kind of two parts to this. One is about responsibility, kind of responsibility and accountability. The extent to which evaluator roles are currently defined as including that publishing stage and taking responsibility for that publishing stage, I think is limited. Certainly in my institution, once I produce the report, it's not mine anymore. And certainly we heard stories about people who said, well, that bit got taken out of the final published thing, or actually before they designed it and went to marketing, they had some thoughts about whose name went in there and what should go in that. Sometimes it's outside of what our remit has been given, even though we personally feel that is part of our responsibility. As an evaluator, I consider that absolutely something I'm thinking about the ethics of when I'm designing my research. I'm thinking about, like, how am I going to disseminate this? Who's going to be involved in that? But it's not in my job. And we have a real conflict about that. And that is something I think roles and responsibilities are definitely something I think needs to potentially change or be tighter defined. The extent to which any of us have really well-defined evaluation jobs, if they were written by somebody who doesn't have the same idea of what evaluation is as us, is going to be interesting anyway. So yeah, responsibility was one part of it. And I think the other part of it is just, yeah, absolutely feeling that, like, wanting to share these things and that being core to the good, and feeling the frustration of that is absolutely a shared thing. And I think the extent to which maybe evaluation is increasingly seen as a product in a regulatory structure which says you need to have an evaluation and doesn't necessarily say anything about we have to publish something. Does it have to be everything? Does it have to be the full message? That is the question that I think people in my institution do genuinely ask. And I think that is an ethical problem.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Ruth. Certainly something that I've learned the hard way, definitely, is to negotiate the dissemination and communication almost at the outset. And even if it isn't us, even if it's not our responsibility, to get some assurance of where is this going to go internally, who is the audience for this going to be, at what stage do we sign that off, and who's involved in that, and even externally, the kind of if that is connected to a regulatory ask or beyond, who's involved in that. And often that catches us out because we're so keen to get started and there's possibly time pressures that we don't think of upfront sharing and dissemination conversations, and that has too many times come back to bite me, definitely. So thank you for raising that one. We're almost out of time. That has absolutely flown by, and thank you everybody for staying with us for this hour. Thank you so much, Ruth, for sharing your practice with us, your research findings. I know that you're really active in the evaluation space, and I know that if there's people that are keen to talk more to you about this, then I'm sure you would be willing. Some people have asked about slides, and we will make sure that we can share slides if that's okay with Ruth. We will have a recording that we will share as well, and both of those will be posted on our Evaluation Collective site. I've taken with us today this kind of notion of the evaluation community, the spirit of that, supporting each other with these often lonely ethical dimensions, and hoping that we can continue some of these conversations through the Evaluation Collective. So thank you for bringing that for us. Thank you, everybody. Our next event is on the 27th of January, and I will be sharing the information about this with our members, and you will also see it through LinkedIn, and it will be particularly talking about a book launch of something that myself and a colleague, many colleagues in the Evaluation Collective and others have worked on. So keep your eyes peeled for another lunchtime event in January. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Ruth. Everybody have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you very much.